Hello, everybody. Welcome. I am Dareth Morrissey with the board of the American Cetacean Society Orange County chapter, with several board members, Kendra and Paul and Lori, and our very distinguished speaker this evening, Lori Marino. We have over 200 participants that are joining us this evening, so that's super exciting, and it's a very current and topical lecture this evening, and I'm going to try not to cry. So just to give you a little bit of background on Lori, she is a PhD, a neuroscientist and expert in animal behavior, intelligence, and self-awareness, and is an adjunct professor in animal studies at New York University. She's a founder and president of the Whale Sanctuary Project and the executive director of the Kimmela Center for Scholarship-based Animal Advocacy. Lori's scientific work focuses on the evolution of the brain and intelligence of dolphins and whales, as well as primates and farmed animals, and on the effects of captivity on wildlife. She has published over 140 peer-reviewed scientific papers, book chapters, and magazine articles. In 2001, she co-authored a groundbreaking study demonstrating the first conclusive evidence for mirror self-recognition in dolphins. Lori also works at the intersection of science and animal law and policy, and is the co-director with Professor Kathy Hessler of the Animal Law and Science Project at George Washington University. She was also a senior lecturer in neuroscience and behavioral biology at Emory University for almost 20 years. So talk about an expert. We have the expert, and we are so pleased to have you this evening. So I won't waste any more time. You can put all of your questions as you think of them in the Q&A. Our chat is disabled. And as we're going through the presentation, Lori might be able to glance at them, or all questions or many questions will be answered at the end. So thank you very much. Lori, take it away.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk about this topic. I think that, well, let me try to advance the slides, and for some reason. There we go. Well, everybody probably knows who these two individuals are. On the left is Kiska, and she is an orca who lived in Marineland, Canada, all by herself for many years, and she died earlier this year at the age of 47. And on the right is Tokitae, also known by her stage name Lolita, who died recently at the age of 57 at the Miami Aquarium while she was being prepared to be moved to her natal waters. And although we have spent a lot of time talking about Tokitae and also Kiska, there are many orcas who have died in captivity. Their stories are unfortunately not rare. In the past 10 years, there have been several orca deaths at SeaWorld, and we're just going to be concentrating on the orcas remaining in the United States in captivity, although there are many more around the world. So in SeaWorld San Antonio, you had Una at the age of 19, little Kiara, who died at the age of 3 months. SeaWorld San Diego, there were 3 deaths there, the youngest one being 7. And then at SeaWorld Orlando, Tillicum and Kayla. And that's just in the past 10 years, and it's just orcas. So let's take a look at how many orcas are in captivity around the world today. It's hard to get a really exact number because most of the data on this comes from the online database, Database, and not every organization is forthcoming with filling in the information for their facility. But we know that in the United States now there are 18 orcas left in captivity, all at SeaWorld. In Argentina, there is one lone orca, Shemenk. In Russia, there is one. In Spain, there are 4 at Marineland Antibes. France, I'm sorry, not in Spain, but in France, Marineland Antibes has a family of 4. China has at least 15 orcas, Japan, several as well. Globally, it's estimated that there are about 50 to 55 orcas in captivity presently. Now, I want to take a look at some of what we know about what happens to orcas living in these marine parks. First thing I want to do is take a look at lifespan statistics. SeaWorld has maintained that the maximum lifespan of both free-ranging and captive orcas is 35 years. They've maintained that for years and years and years, and it's still on their website. But data from free-ranging populations in the Northeast Pacific show that female orcas can live to 80 or 90 years, males 50 to 60 years. Captive orcas of either sex rarely live longer than 30 years, and many of them die in their teens and 20s. 92% of orcas held at SeaWorld have died by the age of 25. Let's look at another statistic, survivorship, which is the probability of surviving to a particular age. In 2015, Jet and Ventry published a peer-reviewed paper when they looked at survivorship for captive orcas around the world. And what they found is that there have been improvements in survivorship for orcas in captivity, entering captivity since 1985. But survival to maturity and reproductive senescence still remains quite poor in captivity compared to free-ranging orcas. And they also found that survivorship of orcas in US facilities is significantly better than in facilities outside the US. Let's take another look at some statistics that tell you something about what's going on in these tanks. Infant mortality statistics. This is really interesting, and I've really been looking into this quite deeply lately. Of the 103 orcas who have been born in captivity globally since 1985 that we know about, 73 have already died, and most of them dying in their first year, or 48 dying in their first year. The bottom line here is that orca birth rates and infant mortality rates have been, at best, the same or only slightly better in captivity than in the wild. Okay, so what is going on here? There seems to be a double standard in the messaging that places like SeaWorld put out. It's the captivity industry double standard. So they like to say that captivity is safer than the wild. But then after every infant death, they claim that their mortality rates are similar to those in the wild in an effort to justify the infant mortality. So they're trying to say, well, they die in the wild too. So don't be surprised if they die in the tanks. But you can't have it both ways. So which is it? How can it be? And really, this is the question. How can it be that infant mortality rates are the same in captivity as in the wild, when in captivity there are no harmful risks, no pollutants, no other dangers, 24/7 veterinary care, and no lack of food? It just doesn't add up. So I want to turn now to welfare and the science of welfare and what we know about how orcas experience welfare in the tanks. The most widely accepted definition of animal welfare is that it comprises the state of an animal's body and mind, and the extent to which its nature is satisfied. And I like this definition from Duncan and Fraser because they talk about the nature and satisfying the nature of the animal. And in a sense, and they are recognizing the fact that each species has a nature that is shaped by millions of years of evolution. Now, in the past, welfare was defined by the absence of negative states, absence of hunger or pain, things like that. But more recently, and fortunately, welfare has become recognized as a state that includes many positive factors like the ability to play, the ability to experience joy, the ability to explore, all of these things that are not necessarily the absence of something, but not negative, but they are actually positive states. So good welfare is the absence of negative states, but also the presence or the opportunity to experience positive states. And feelings, too, are now central to welfare concepts. And more progressive welfare ideas are starting to recognize that not only do other animals have feelings, that they need challenges and the need to exercise choice and autonomy. And these things are very important. When you have a captive animal, like an orca in a tank, they're fed the same way all the time. They don't need to go anywhere to hunt, to coordinate, to get food. And on the positive side of that, they don't have to worry about starving. On the negative side of that, it is their nature to travel together and hunt together and catch their own food. And they are denied this ability in the tanks. So there are two sides to a lot of welfare issues. So what I like to tell my students is there are three central questions about captive wild animal welfare. The first question you should ask yourself is, who are you? So you're faced with an animal, an individual of a certain species, in a zoo, in a marine park, anywhere. First thing you want to know is, who are you? And what that means is you need to understand who that is from the individual to the species. So every individual whale has its own individual life history and personality and experiences, but they also have aspects of their nature shaped by the fact that they are orcas and the evolution of orcas. So there's many levels to understanding who an individual animal is when you're looking at that. And then the next question is, what do you need to thrive? And again, this ranges from individual differences to the nature of the species. And notice I didn't say, what do you need to survive? I said, what do you need to thrive? Because thriving is really what you want to really be looking at when you're considering captive wild animal welfare. It's not enough for them to just eke out an existence and survive. And then the third question comes back to the environment. Who are you? What do you need to thrive? And do you have the opportunity to thrive? Does the captive environment afford you the opportunity to live like a member of your species, apart from anthropocentric biases? And that's something that's very important that I'll return to. So let's look at some welfare issues that are faced by captive orcas. First of all, let's take a look at systemic and opportunistic infections. Many of the infections captive orcas succumb to are known as opportunistic infections. That is, infections by pathogens that may typically be harmless, but can cause disease under certain unhealthy or compromised conditions. And one of the conditions is a weakened immune system. Common causes of death for captive orcas are pneumonia, which is the #1 cause of death, gastrointestinal disease, meningitis, encephalitis, candidiasis. These are all found in the wild as well. Many of these incidents of death from opportunistic infections appear to be correlated with antibiotic and antifungal resistance brought about by the fact that many marine parks use antibiotics and antifungals prophylactically. So they just regularly medicate them so that when they do get a bacterial infection, they are already resistant to it. Let's take a look at another category of welfare: oral stereotypies, dental disease, and illness. There's been a lot of work done in this area. What you see there is the lower jaw of an orca who is living in a tank, and the teeth are missing pretty much, and you can see holes drilled in the teeth, and that's due to a stereotypy. Stereotypy is a persistent, repetitive action that doesn't appear to have any obvious purpose. They're associated with psychological stress and generally poor well-being. And orcas exhibit a lot of stereotypies in the tanks. Examples of oral stereotypies are things like repeated biting on the hard tank surfaces and gates or on hard toys. And that's how they get teeth like this. And a survey done of tooth wear showed that over 60% of captive orcas in the United States and Spain, I believe they looked at Loro Parque, have fractured mandibular teeth. And 24% exhibit major to extreme coronal tooth wear down to the gums. And while we do see some communities of free-ranging orcas with tooth wear, that is only in those communities where they are processing fish that have hard scales. You don't normally see this in the wild. Now, the problem here is that these behaviors lead to extensive and chronic dental pathologies and provide a pathway for pathogens to cause those opportunistic systematic diseases. And then there's self-harm and other abnormal behaviors. Some of the ways that orcas express or distress in tanks is through a number of different abnormal behaviors, both at the individual and at the social level. Now, stereotypies are fairly common, but there's also self-harm. On the left is a photo of Hugo, an orca who was at the Miami Aquarium, who repeatedly, he was captured from the wild, and he repeatedly bashed his head against the side of the tank until he died of a brain aneurysm. In the middle, you see Morgan. She's an orca who, again, is from the wild, and she's not in the tank. She's out on the concrete, which is very bad for cetaceans. And she's out on the concrete repeatedly because of the fact that in the small tank that she's in, there are males in there who are chasing her and aggressing towards her, and there's nowhere to escape except to literally jump out of the tank. And on the right is a very unfortunate incident that occurred several years ago between two orcas at SeaWorld San Diego, Corky and Candu. And They got into an altercation of some kind during a performance, and they collided. Candu bled out. You can see the blood gushing out of her blowhole, and she died. And she died in front of her child, her calf. So these are just some of the things that you see, including failure to thrive of infants and poor parenting. It's just something that is very, very different from the way infants are supported in the wild. So let's stop and think about this. What is the missing piece of the puzzle? Let's think about an orca in a tank at SeaWorld. They get fed every day high quality food. They have 24/7 high quality veterinary care. There's no pollution, no oil spills or other dangers. So the question is, shouldn't captive orcas be living long, healthy lives? But they're not. So what is that missing piece of the puzzle? I think the missing piece is the fact that living in a tank causes orcas to suffer chronic stress. And I'm going to lay out for you the evidence for that. Stress is an organism's response to a situation that's a deviation from optimal functioning. If you're a whale and you evolved in the sea, in the ocean, and you're living in a concrete tank, that's a deviation from optimal functioning, and it's going to cause stress. And what all animals do, including humans, when they're faced with this situation, is they correct through physiological and psychological mechanisms. And the system for dealing with stress is shared across mammals. So this is really important because this is a system that's known as a highly conserved system. Here is a figure from our paper 2021 showing drawings through the brains, cross sections of the brains of an African elephant, a bottlenose dolphin, a human, and a rat. And we've color coded, so up, down, left, right. We've color coded some of the important limbic and other structures that are involved in responding to stress. So for instance, in gray is the thalamus, in the putamen is here. You can see that every single brain has gray, red, blue, and green in different proportions and slightly different shapes, but they are all there. And what that says is that that same system exists, whether you are a rat or an elephant or a cetacean or a human. So these are shared brain mechanisms involved in mounting a stress response. So what is the stress response? I'm not going to go into great detail, but it's something that's been studied for decades now. It's very well known. The stress response is a response first of the brain to something that happens that causes a fight or flight response. And so you're walking down a dark alley, somebody jumps out at you and you get scared, and then your body reacts to that. That's an acute stress. So what happens is that your pituitary gland sends chemicals to your adrenal glands, which then let down certain hormones, like stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. Cortisol is a big one. And So cortisol starts circulating in your body and causes a number of physiological responses. But this is a system that evolved to deal with acute stress. And after that acute stress subsides, like you're an animal being chased by a predator, after it's over, there are a series of negative feedback circuits that kick in that allow your brain and your body to go back to homeostasis. Now, the problem comes when the stress doesn't go away. The system then stays ramped up. Cortisol floods the system, and it eventually causes damage to the brain and the immune system. And there are a number of feedback circuits here, so that the brains of chronically stressed animals show a number of defects, and the immune system sort of goes down because it did not evolve to deal with high levels of cortisol circulating in the body. The effects are behavioral dysregulation and opportunistic infections, exactly the things that you see in captive orcas. And so here is the question that we all need to ask ourselves. And that is this: can adaptation to 52 million years in the ocean be circumvented by an artificial anthropocentric environment? That really is the question. I propose that the answer is no. And the evidence comes from the poor welfare of orcas and tanks. So then the question is, can we do better? Well, certainly we can. Certainly we can. And there are three ways that we can do better for these animals. First, we can recognize and respect the nature of these whales. As I mentioned, you have to know that you're dealing with an animal whose ability to thrive is based upon certain adaptations being played out. And if it doesn't have the opportunity to do that, its welfare is going to be compromised. You cannot fit a square peg in a round hole. That causes stress. So first, recognize and respect the nature of these whales. The way that orca nature is not respected in marine parks is the fact that, you know, they are fed in the same way all the time, and there is a lack of real recognition that they really don't want to open their mouth and have dead fish dropped in. Now, that's all that can happen in captivity, including in sanctuaries. But at least needs to be acknowledged that that isn't good welfare for orcas. Good welfare is them going out and getting their own food and having the challenge and the stimulation of that. Secondly, adopt the perspective of the whale, not the human. And again, there's so many things that happen to orcas in captivity that seem to be good ideas from the perspective of a human, like being fed in the same way all the time, et cetera, et cetera. But from the perspective of the whale, it's not necessarily a good thing. And then prioritize the whale's needs over that of humans. And that's a key critical difference between commercial marine parks and aquariums and sanctuaries that I'll talk about momentarily. In a marine park, people have to come through the turnstiles, pay for tickets, come and see the animals, and they don't just want to see them, they want to see them doing spectacular tricks and all kinds of things. And in the case of many other animals, for instance, bottlenose dolphins, people come in and they expect to be in the water with the dolphins and ride on the dolphins and feed them and touch them. And so there are all of these priorities that marine parks have, because of their business model, visitors have to come sometimes before the welfare of the animal. Otherwise, they go out of business. So in order to do better, we have to prioritize the whale's needs over that of humans. And so now I want to turn to a model of movement, if you will, around the globe that says that we can do better. We can do better in the form of authentic sanctuaries for dolphins and whales. What is a sanctuary? It's a place to thrive, at least the opportunity to thrive. It's where the whale's well-being and individualized lifetime care are the priorities and the sole priority, not the visitor experience, not any other kinds of research, but the whale. There's no performances or demonstrations. There's no breeding because you don't want to create more captive whales. Sanctuaries are still captivity. No unnecessary invasive medical procedures. Autonomy and choice and are promoted, and a natural life is promoted as much as possible. Now, sanctuaries are not a natural situation for orcas or any other wild animals. Wild animals need to be in the wild. But we can get a lot closer for them than keeping them in concrete tanks that are highly impoverished artificial environments and forcing them to be in proximity to humans and in many cases performing and having people touch them and all of that. So that we can definitely get a lot closer. An authentic sanctuary does research and fully shares data. We do research because, and non-invasive research, because we want to know how the animals are adapting to the new environment. This is critically important. Sanctuaries are new. We need to gather the data that tell us whether this is working for the whales and then adjust given those data. So there is an iterative process here. So research from the get-go is very important, and full data sharing. It's also a wonderful way to do research that can then be transferred or applied to the wild, because the contingencies and the atmosphere in a sanctuary are so much closer to that of free-ranging populations than those of animals living in tanks. We can do authentic education. If somebody wants to know about a whale in a sanctuary, you don't have to make up a story about how they're happy and healthy and they're the fortunate ones. You can tell the true story of how this animal, this individual, ended up in captivity, why they really should be in the ocean, why they can't be in the ocean, and show and teach people about their lived experience. So education from a sanctuary can be so much more authentic than from a commercial facility. And of course, sanctuaries have to be sustainable with the environment and located in a community that embraces the sanctuary mission. So recently, the Whale Sanctuary Project got together with the National Aquarium in Baltimore and Merlin Entertainment Sea Life Trust. And we worked for the past 2 years to develop something that's critically important, and that is accreditation guidelines for cetacean sanctuaries. Cetacean sanctuaries are starting to come online. There's going to be more and more of them in the future, but there needs to be quality control. There are many facilities around the world that call themselves sanctuaries, and they are not sanctuaries. They are simply entertainment parks. And so there has to be a way for consumers, visitors to be able to tell the difference. How do you know that something is a real sanctuary or not? So we're very proud of the fact that we used our accumulated experience and empirical evidence for what animals need to thrive. And we created a detailed document for the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries that represents the first document or the first set of accreditation guidelines for cetacean sanctuaries. Now, I know that there are a lot of people who don't like the idea of a sanctuary because they feel that it is a risky proposition, or they feel that it is something that is too dissimilar from the safety of the tanks, and that you cannot do with the whales what you can do in marine parks. But in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. In marine parks and aquariums, orcas and the other animals are fed, they get veterinary care, and they are protected. It is a plain fact that in an authentic sanctuary, the same is true. The animals are fed, they get 24/7 veterinary care, and they are protected. So all of the things that marine parks tout as being good things for the orcas and the other animals they have are also part of sanctuaries. But sanctuaries have more. They do all of this in a natural ocean environment where the residents have much more choice, much more stimulation, and more autonomy. Is it as good as being in the wild? No way. Is it a lot better than being in a concrete tank? You bet. And so authentic sanctuaries are a way to get a lot closer to good welfare for captive orcas who cannot thrive in tanks, but cannot be released into the ocean. This is a way to bring them closer to the kind of environment that their brain and their body expects, and give them an opportunity, a better opportunity to thrive. So now I want to tell you a little bit about the Whale Sanctuary Project's site. We spent a lot of time looking for an appropriate site for sanctuary for orcas and belugas in separate areas. And we eventually, in 2020, announced this site, Port Hilford Bay, Nova Scotia. It's a beautiful bay on the eastern shore of Nova Scotia. And you can see in the forefront, this whole region is the sanctuary water, not the area in the back here. That's too shallow. This is an island that comes out. It's called Bearshaw Island, and it provides beautiful protection from storms. We've been through 4 hurricanes at this site, and it's really amazing how this Bearshaw Island works as a buffer. So this is our sanctuary site. And this is an artist's rendition of the sanctuary, this time with beluga whales, but could be the same with orcas. We are going to net off 100 acres, which is orders of magnitude greater than the largest tank in the world. And the depths vary up to 16, 17 meters deep. And momentarily, I'm going to show you what the whales see when they get into the sanctuary. The path to breaking ground has been long, hard, and anyone who thinks that this is an easy thing to do needs to come on our website and get an idea of what the different things are that have to be done to create a sanctuary somewhere. It's harder in the water than on land, but it's still hard on land. For the past 3 years, we've been working in several domains: permitting and leasing, government agency engagement, that's provincial with Nova Scotia. We have had to and just completed a series of in-depth environmental analyses on land and in the sea. We have had to look at geotechnical engineering factors that will come into play when we create the sanctuary. Infrastructure design, the perimeter net, and building it, and we already have designed the net. It will be ready to go as soon as we are able to install it. Funding procurement. This is about a $12 million project. And so funding is extremely important, and all of our funding comes from donors, philanthropists, etc. And we're happy to say that we recently procured a grant in the amount of $5 million from the Wendy P. McCaw Foundation. That's being held in escrow until such time that we can start to use it to start to build on the site. And we have a lot of donors, but we also need many, many more. We've had to purchase the land adjacent to the site. First Nations consultation has been extremely important. The Indigenous people there, called the Mi'kmaq, have been our partners in developing the site, and it's very important that they are consulted from the very beginning. So the first time I went to Nova Scotia to look for sites, the first person I met was Chief Terry Paul, who was one of the Indigenous leaders there, because it's important that the First Nations are the first ones to know about this and to advocate for it. There's community consultations. I just came back from Nova Scotia a day ago. We had another town meeting. So all of these things have to be kept in play, and they have been kept in play over the past 2.5 years since we found the site. But it is not easy, and I can tell you that I didn't think it was going to be this difficult, but we are making tremendous progress. Here's some pictures from our site itself, showing some of the things that happened over the past few months. We've had to do analyses of sediment and soil, looking at the water table, locating areas that would be good to put buildings on, etc. We've had to do extensive surveys of flora and fauna, doing subsurface sediment sampling, mapping of eelgrass. That's because eelgrass is protected, and we have to ensure that we are not going to have a negative impact on it. But we also have to ensure that we're not going to have a negative impact on any flora or fauna living in the area. And we map the bottom of the site as well, so we can get an idea of how we can position our nets. So now I want to take you to the site, first above the water, then under, and then above, from the point of view of a whale, an orca, who is now living in this beautiful site. It's a very short video. Whoops, sorry. So after seeing that, I think you can get an idea of the character of the site that we've chosen for the orcas and belugas. You can get an idea of what a natural environment is like, the complexity, the different plants, the fish, the crabs, the snails, all the animals that can come and go through the nets, and provide stimulation for the whales. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't have to help them to understand that they are now in an environment that is not impoverished, that they are also in an environment where they can be free to explore and play, if you will. And there may be some forms of enrichment that we need to employ on that road. Because adaptation to the sanctuary will be something that will be a process that will require very, very careful observation of the animals, and not just dropping them in 100 acres of water, but keeping them in a smaller place and then seeing how they adapt, and then moving them through a series of steps until they're finally able to have the full experience of the sanctuary. And a lot of the work we do is informed by another animal, elephants, because it turns out that there are a lot of similarities between what elephant welfare is like in zoos and orca welfare is like in marine parks. And we have a number of advisors who have created successful elephant sanctuaries. And so I want to ask all of you this question. Is there any reason to think that the kinds of improvements in welfare that clearly take place in elephant sanctuaries cannot occur in cetacean sanctuaries? It just has to be done. Thank you. And if you'd like to know more about what we're doing, if you'd like to donate, if you'd like to ask questions, please go to whalesanctuary.org, and we're more than happy to chat. So I will end there and go to the Q&A. I'll stop my sharing and go to the Q&A. Joe Bedrosian says, you forgot about Shemank. No, I didn't. I mentioned Shemank. He's the one orca who is living in Mundo Marino in Argentina. And we haven't forgotten about him. We inquire all the time about his health and about whether there is a path forward for him. Now, I don't think that is probable given what we know now about his well-being, but there is no orca that we've forgotten about. We have several that we're looking at as potential candidates. So thank you for that question. Dawn says, was the 3-month-old born in captivity? Yes, the 3-month-old was born in captivity. Dennis Kelly asks, how did SeaWorld explain Orcas' lifespan, given what they maintain about lifespan? I'm not sure I understand that question, but if you want to pose the question, Dennis, again, I'll look for it later on in the queue. An anonymous attendee wants to know how we know what a whale is feeling. Isn't that anthropomorphic? No, it's not. Because there is such a thing as critical anthropomorphism. Well, first of all, let me start. Anthropomorphism is the seeing uniquely human traits in other animals, right? So if I say that orcas have a desire to, be president of the United States, that's anthropomorphic, right? But it's only anthropomorphic if the other species doesn't have that trait. It's not anthropomorphic if the other species shares that trait. How do we know that orcas and other cetaceans have feelings and that those feelings are likely to be quite similar to those of our own and other mammals? Well, because they are mammals. Two, they have the same brain structures that process emotions in the brain. It's called the limbic system. And that's another system that is shared across all mammals, and it's highly conserved. And it does the same thing in all animals, as far as we can tell. So there's no reason to think that the limbic system is doing something incredibly weird or wacky or different than what it does in all other mammals. That would not be parsimonious. We know that they have feelings because of their behavior. And we know what they feel in tanks because of their welfare. The welfare tells you what they're feeling. So, although we don't know exactly what it's like to be a whale, they don't know exactly what it's like to be a human. We are both mammals. We are both large-brained, highly social mammals. We have an idea that there is some shared psychology across species. Not the same, not exactly the same, but different versions of the same thing. And that's how I see it. Let's see. Here's another question that I will address because there's a misconception. It's about the beluga whales in the Sea Life Trust Sanctuary. There is an existing sanctuary in Iceland, put together by Merlin Entertainment Sea Life Trust. And there's 2 beluga whales who were in a tank in Asia, and they are now living in a tank close to the sanctuary site. So why are they not at the sanctuary? The sanctuary site has been up for a couple of years now, and they have put them in the sanctuary site, taken them out, put them in, taken them out. True. But first of all, the reason that the belugas are not living in the sanctuary site in Iceland now is not because of their response or reaction to living in the sanctuary. This one, because there was some adjustments that had to be made to the sanctuary that once the whales were in, that was realized. And so in order to make it a more workable and a safer situation, they took the whales out again and they made those adjustments, and those take time. Second time was the fact that there was a gasoline spill. A truck actually submerged, and they had to take that out and clean the whole area. They've been mainly technical things. They have not been about the belugas not adapting to the sanctuary environment. They have not really had a chance to adapt. And we are hoping that they will be going back in the spring, and that with all these changes and improvements that they will adjust to the sanctuary, and we'll see. It's a question, but we'll see. We have every reason to think that. Tracy asks, why don't they feed them live salmon? For instance, it seems like it would be easy to get live farm salmon at the very least. Well, the reason that orcas and other cetaceans in captivity aren't fed live fish is primarily because you need to know how much they're taking in order to keep them healthy in that environment. So you need to know that you've given X amount of fish to each individual and you keep a record of that. That would be true in the sanctuary as well. Now, if the whales in the sanctuary want to start going after fish and hunt them or play with them or even eat them, great, but we're not going to depend upon that for the nutrition. It's another question. How will we limit breeding? This is another question that comes up quite a bit. What, no breeding? But, you know, isn't that a problem? Yes, sure it is. It's a problem, but it's equally a problem to be forced to breed in a concrete tank through artificial insemination, through lack of choice, and all kinds of things like that. Corky, who is a 56-year-old orca living in a tank in SeaWorld San Diego, has had 7 pregnancies. Not a single one has resulted in a whale growing to adulthood. Kiska had 5 calves. All of them perished early. That's a welfare cost as well. And it's a welfare cost to be artificially inseminated, and it's a welfare cost to not have any choice in the matter about who you're breeding with and how you raise your calf, because it is what it is. There's no space to disperse, there's aggression and so forth. So there are lots of problems trying to raise a calf, an orchid calf, in a tank with a bunch of other calves. How will we be preventing breeding? Well, it will depend upon the makeup of the group. There are chemical means, and those will be supervised by veterinarians. Those chemical means, you know, essentially being on the pill, will mean that we will have to be very cautious about how long they are on the pill and times when they need to be off of it, etc. But it does work. And there may be some separation of the sexes. We'll do what we can to try to allow them to engage in as much of normal social behavior, including sexual behavior, as they can, without it resulting in more captive orcas. And that is just one of the aspects of sanctuaries that that is part of the model, just as trying to grow their collections of animals as part of the model for places like SeaWorld. Another question is, how do you plan to have medical care for emergency situations if sanctuaries don't have access to medical pools? They will have medical pools. We will have medical pools, just as SeaWorld does, the same thing. We're not just going to have a netted off 100-acre space and the animals are just plopped into that space. We will have medical pools and smaller pools that when they first come to the sanctuary, they come in and into a smaller area where they're allowed to adapt. And we make sure that they're okay before moving on to the next phase. If an animal becomes sick, then they will go into the medical pool, just as is the case in all of these marine parks. So it's not true that we won't have medical pools. We'll have all of those things. one person asked, well, if an animal was captured, wouldn't it be better to release them back in their home region? Well, of course, but that is what they tried to do with Tokitae, and she was going to be released into a sea pen in her natal waters had she not passed away. But there's only one other orca in the United States who was captured, and that's Corky, and she has been in captivity for so long that it would be very risky to put her back in the ocean where she came from. Now, if she can be released to a sanctuary where her family of northern resident orcas is, then that would be the ideal situation. Somebody asks, in the sanctuary, would you keep the belugas and orcas together? No. No. Let's see. Can orcas get sunburned in a sanctuary? This is a question by Leslie. No, because like in the ocean, they will have enough depth to dive and be underwater. In marine parks, it's really interesting. Everything that they do is above water, above the surface. They have to look at trainers and interact with them. They're fed above the surface. They don't have a lot of depth in the tanks. So there's really not a whole lot of spending time under the water. And as a result, they do get sunburned. And as a result, they get mosquito bites that sometimes transmit some pretty nasty diseases because they are logging on the surface. But we don't expect that to be the case in a deep water, like in a sanctuary. Molly asks a really good question. Are there any concerns for the oldest individuals that may face physical difficulties with the transfer, or individuals that may not be able to form a cohesive relationship in a sanctuary? Yeah, yes, absolutely. Transfers are always risky. There's no guarantees, but they're done all the time by SeaWorld and other marine parks. And the key is to understand the individuals and their health. Before any whale would come to the sanctuary, we'd want to know everything about their medical status, any pathogens they're carrying, their immune system function, just anything and everything we could possibly know about them. If they're older, yeah, that adds a risk to it. And then in terms of forming a cohesive relationship, what we would prefer is to bring whales in at least 2 at a time, and choose whales who are social with each other in the tanks, so that they are not experiencing this alone. They don't have to adapt alone. It's so much easier when they have a friend with them. And so we would like to bring in at least pairs of whales who have each other for support. And then how the social relationships and the groups form once we have 6, 8, 10 belugas, for instance, or 2 or 3 orcas. That will depend upon the whales, and we'll do everything we can to encourage them to have the support of the whole group and to interact as a cohesive group. But if they don't, they will at least have some space to disperse, which is the problem in the tanks, is that if two individuals don't get along, there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to disperse. In a sanctuary, if they don't get along, tensions get high, then they can disperse. And that keeps that hyper-aggression down. Let's see. Someone asked, who will be the candidates that would be brought into the sanctuary? Where and how will you get these orcas out? Well, to get any orca, beluga, dolphin out of a captive facility into a sanctuary takes working with, in collaboration with the facility itself. And so just as in the case with Tokitae, where the Miami Aquarium decided that they wanted to work with scientists and veterinarians and trainers to see if they can get her ready to be transferred back to her natal lands, that was their decision. Without that decision, that wouldn't happen. So it's very important for facilities to work with sanctuary organizations. The other thing is that, you know, for the orcas or belugas living in a marine park, they get to know their trainers and the trainers know them very well. And ideally, those trainers would come with them to the sanctuary so that they can maintain that relationship, but also because they know those animals well enough that they will have a really better idea of how they're adapting. So it's, you know, it is just a matter of negotiating and of keeping the lines of communication open with these facilities so that they will talk to us. Let's see. What would you say to the people who would argue that culling the remaining captive orcas would be more ethical given the stresses of transport and existing communication difficult? I would say that is not a solution. Killing, which is what culling is, killing is not a solution. When, especially when there are alternatives. Again, transport is a stressor, but if it can be done well, it's done all the time. And personally, I think that, you know, where there's life, there's hope. And so it just doesn't make sense to me to think about arguing for killing off the remaining orcas. These are individuals. They have a right to live their lives, and we want them to live the best life they can. Someone asked an important question here about how will you know when a whale is ready to be released from a sanctuary back to the wild? We are not going to be releasing whales from the sanctuary to the wild. They will have a permanent home in the sanctuary because they don't have the skills to survive in the wild, and there's no group to go back to. They have to be embedded in a pod or a family group or a social group, and that doesn't exist. So the wild is not an option for captive orcas right now. Let's see, how many orcas will share the sanctuary? Well, it will depend on if we have belugas as well. We are creating a sanctuary that can accommodate about 8 belugas and 2 or 3 orcas, maybe more if we don't have orcas, maybe more orcas if we have fewer belugas, but some combination thereof. We are not going to exceed the carrying capacity of the sanctuary, which means that we need to make sure that the sanctuary waters stay clean and flush through. And we know exactly how many animals we can have before we start to risk going over that. Amy asked an important question. If a cetacean becomes so endangered, would captive breeding be acceptable if it were in a sanctuary, just to keep the species around? Wow, that's a $60 million question. It's an important question. And in the case of highly endangered species, like the paquita, for instance, where there's only a few left, capturing them and bringing them into captivity to breed has been thought of and has been tried, and it failed. And it failed because of the fact that these animals just, when they were captured, they died of stress. They just couldn't handle it. So there was no way we could bring a paquita into a sanctuary or a tank or anywhere and expect to grow a breeding population to replenish the ones in the wild. It's just something that sounds good, but in reality it's not really been successful. So that's problematic. Let's see. Somebody asked about the fact that a marine park that's for profit would want to replace their whales with some other form of revenue, right? And so they are invested in maintaining the whales, keeping them performing, keeping them there, and doing whatever they can to bring people into the park. And that is the case. What we hope and maintain is that there are ways for places like SeaWorld and other places to transition to a sanctuary model and still maintain their revenue, maybe not with people riding on top of bottlenose dolphins or seeing orcas flip up in the air, but by actually doing real education and real conservation. They certainly have the expertise. They just need to do it. And if they did it, they can still have their entertainment parks and their rides and all of that, but they can also be doing some real animal welfare and conservation work through sanctuaries. And so that's something that we know that they see that, and it's just a matter of when they will be willing to do something about that. Somebody asked about how will sanctuaries stay funded if multiple ones are competing for donations. There's more than enough money to go around. There are elephant sanctuaries all over the world. There are primate sanctuaries. There are big cat sanctuaries, and they're all thriving. They're not shutting each other down or competing. There's more than enough funding in the world for a few cetacean sanctuaries, just as there are for other captive wild animal sanctuaries. It's not one or the other. let's see. Catherine asks, well, orcas are remarkably intelligent. They are. How would we know that they would not be able to adapt back into their wild state or to learn new behaviors to survive? Isn't such thinking still based upon human assumptions? Yes. And here's the thing. I mean, well, yes and no. Yes, because it could very well be the case that they might learn to feed themselves. But the fact is that without a social group, an orca really isn't an orca. I mean, this is what they need and they need to be able to live and travel with a group that supports them. So reverting back to the wild state, it is true that all dolphins and whales living in captivity now are still wild animals. They're not domesticated. And so theoretically they could. But again, I think that it becomes a very risky proposition. So if we want to say that, orcas are smart, they'll figure it out, just dump them back in the ocean. There's an argument for that. It's not one I agree with because you're risking the lives of the animals. That's a bridge too far from being fed in a concrete tank to just going into the open ocean with no social support, etc. I think it's a bit too much. It's certainly not any kind of a risk that anyone I know wants to take. Someone asked about whether taxpayers will ever be asked to pay for sanctuaries. No, at least not our sanctuary. Absolutely not. And final question is, in your experience, what are the most effective ways to put an end to orca captivity? What can ordinary people do? It really is very simple. Don't support places that keep orcas for entertainment and other animals. Stop the breeding in places like SeaWorld and other marine parks, and transfer those individuals who are able to a sanctuary, and make sanctuaries be the exit ramp for keeping orcas in the entertainment business. We know they don't do well in the tanks. It's time to end it. And the way to end it is using the best science we have and the best know-how we have about how to bring these animals to a more natural environment. And everyone I know who runs a sanctuary feels the same way, that someday they hope there's no need for a sanctuary because there will be no healthy animals living in entertainment parks. There will always be animals who, for one reason or another, maybe get injured or sick and they can't live out in the ocean on their own. But there is absolutely no reason for a healthy individual to be living in an entertainment park. That's a thing of the past. And I think sanctuaries are the way forward to do that, to accomplish that.
I think that is a great ending note. And I love that you proved everything through science and passion and intellect and knowledge. And it wasn't just emotion based, because it is such a highly, emotional topic. But to remove that and just present data, and it was absolutely spectacular. And reading through a lot of the questions from former trainers and people that are just so supportive of what you're doing, to be, to read those was absolutely heartwarming. That this is it's when you know better, you do better, and we know better. Maybe once upon a time, we didn't, but there's no excuse for it now. So thank you for your life's work and passion and dedication to hopefully seeing this through fruition. We really appreciate your time and your knowledge. Thank you so very much, Lori, for this evening.
Thank you.
And thank you all for attending. And please go
Thanks.
to the Whale Sanctuary Project and donate money and see your dreams a reality. One question, do you happen to know the maximum depth of that in Nova Scotia? One of our board
16
members
to
asked.
17 meters.
Okay.
About 16, 17 meters, but the depth, as you saw in the video there, that the bottom is just natural subsurface soil, sand, and it varies, and there's contours, etc. And there's places where it's much more shallow, and then everything in between, and up to about 16 to 17 meters.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Be well.
Yes. Have a good night, everyone.